Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, COVID-19 Recovery in the Black Community. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor and Director of our Economic Justice Program here at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation. This webinar builds and picks up on a series of articles that NPQ published this fall on Black male leadership. We are joined here today by three panelists. Tony Pickett is CEO of the Grounded Solutions Network, a Black-led national affordable housing nonprofit based in Washington, D.C., and was the initiator of our Black Male Leadership series. Also joining us is Marcus Little, founder and senior partner at Frontline Solutions, a Black-owned national social impact consulting firm, and a collaborator with Tony on that series. And lastly, we are also joined by Kari LeVar White, who is co-founder and executive director of the Brotherhood Sister Soul, BroSis, a youth development and educational organization based in Harlem, and author of the novel Passage. And now to break through the fourth wall with a little bit of information about the recording you're going to see, we did have some technical difficulties, and unfortunately that means we lost the first half of the webinar. The good news is that we were able to preserve the second half of the webinar. In the first half, Tony and Marcus discussed why they chose to create a series specifically on the leadership experience of Black men in the nonprofit sector, and Kari spoke of his reaction to that series as a reader. We looked at the state of the movement, with Marcus critiquing how Time magazine named the movement for racial justice as a finalist for Person of the Year, but dehistoricized it, absurdly dating the movement from the murder of George Floyd in May. Tony spoke about the development of Black leadership in nonprofits, including in the community land trust movement. And Kari talked about the racial wealth gap and the need for nonprofits to not so much make space for Black leadership as get out of the way. And that brings us to the part of the recording we can share with you, beginning with a question on race, class, gender, and COVID-19. So with no further ado, we join the webinar in progress at that point. So I did want to move the discussion into, we had COVID in the title for a reason. It's obviously affecting, everything in this country and the world. How do you see, and this is intentionally broad, but how do you see race, gender, and class intersecting amid the crisis that is COVID? You can take that any way you want. So I sort of threw this up to the group.
I have to say, in our work, we know that, again, the disparity is that communities of color are suffering greater negative impact, both from a health perspective, from an economic and jobs perspective. Again, my direct work, we're now trying to develop new innovative strategies for assisting existing distressed homeowners. It's not about so much getting new people into new homes as about keeping people who are now suffering because of the combination of COVID, job loss, health issues, really trying to figure out how to stabilize those folks and reduce the burden that they're facing. And again, this cuts across renters and homeowners. Both groups are really facing a challenge around this. So there is no sort of exemption for communities of color in particular from any of the negative consequences of this. And again, I think we have to decide really as a nation, well, who do we want to support? Do we really want to, and again, our field is housing a human right. That's how we have been framing the conversation and saying to folks, well, yes, it should be, just like healthcare should be a human right. So we've got to really decide which direction we're going in as a nation. And I've tied this back to sort of our philosophy about capitalism. I've made the statement multiple times, the sort of first big instance of global capitalism was the transatlantic slave trade, really moving human bodies and trading them and making profit off of them. I consider that to be a prime example of global capitalism. And we've built wealth in this nation based on that. So, Kari, your comments about sort of this wealth inequality, the racial wealth gap, the fact that average white family's net worth is 10 times more than the average Black family in this nation, that stems from that whole history and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. And so it's time to really reckon with that and decide, okay, if we're going to make a shift, where will the resources be prioritized and who will be served? And let's approach some of the programs and systems that we've put in place much differently. Most of that was created by folks who came with this racial bias lens when they created the policies and the regulations. And we've been suffering from that ever since. And now's the time to start to attack that at the root.
You know, like the question around the intersection of like race and gender identity, like the necessity of that question is a exercise in necessary redundancy, right? And so, because I think, you know, Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality, like sort of, yes, it's brilliant work, but it was a necessary frame and necessary work because of how normalized the invisibility of Black women was, right? Like that was normalized, and so there needed to be a body of work, something that was scholarly and super smart that like interrogated, right, and pushed back against that normalization. Or it could be around like sort of the frames around diversity, equity, and inclusion. They are necessary inventions because of institutions were inherently exclusive because we were committed to like sort of maintaining white supremacy and patriarchy. So you had to like create some frames that say, hey, this thing that's normal, here is some terminology and framing to push back against the normalization of anchoring everything in white supremacy and patriarchy. So I think in the same way, like it is the question around just the intersection of race and gender in sort of response to COVID is really hopefully pushing system leaders, be it philanthropy, government, et cetera, to ask, because our starting point is not intersectional, to ask to ask a series of questions. What about Black people? What about Black women? What about sort of like queer folk? What about sort of folk with disabilities? What about fill in the blank? We have to go bullet point by bullet point, identity by identity, because we weren't sort of taught and raised under the premise to default an intersectional analysis. So there is an answer to all of those questions. What about this group? What about this group? What about this group? That continues to support the reality of how anchored white supremacy is in all our systems in the country.
I would say, Steve, when people ask this question sometimes, what did you expect?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you, again, are basing your understanding of the realities we face in an understanding of history, and to Tony's point and Marcus's point and what I've been talking about, it's not about, always going back to history because it tells us everything we need to know, but it's about history guiding where we are today. It informs where we are today, right? This idea that it's constantly present. And so, people always are talking about COVID and inequalities about COVID. I would say COVID is the infection. Racial and economic inequality is the sore or the wound. They keep talking about the infection, and that's a problem. But if you come, I work in the New York City context. I know the people on here nationally, but it's kind of the numbers I focus on. There's 9 million people in the city of New York. Pre-COVID, 1/3 were living in poverty or on the poverty line, 33%. Pre-COVID, all the people being locked up were Black and brown. Pre-COVID, there was economic and educational inequality that intersected with housing inequality to produce a situation where Black and brown kids are not being served in our school system. Pre-COVID, the lifetime expectancy on the Upper East Side was 91 years. and 2 miles away in central Harlem, it was 70 years. That's pre-COVID. So COVID doesn't come out and decide it's just looking for Black and brown bodies. It doesn't have some drive behind it. What it finds is people who are more exposed, less access to healthcare, less access to healthy food, frontline workers, people who can't quarantine, people who can't stay in their homes, people who live in tighter conditions, multiple people in a home because of poverty, people whose parents have to work and there's no one to supervise the child at home. This is all about racial and economic inequality. And so the fact that you see disproportionate death in indigenous communities, Black communities, and brown communities is a reflection, again, about the very state of the nation and what it's always been, and a lack of investments. You know, Tony works in housing. This study came out last year. I just think it's such a crystallizing statistic, and I reference it often. To provide housing relief for all homeless people in this country, sufficient money to have a sufficient baseline home in their home community is the same price for everyone in the nation than it is to build an aircraft carrier. And this country continues in successive administrations to not take care of that issue and instead to spend money on an aircraft carrier. And so then when a virus comes in that attacks those who are most exposed, who are most desperate economically, and people say, oh my God, what does it reveal about America? It doesn't reveal anything about America. It's a continuing, perpetual reality in this nation. And that's what has to be dealt with, because the next virus will have a different name, but it will do the exact same thing.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks. I don't know, Carl, do you want to say anything about how COVID has affected the work of BROCIS in particular? And how
so this is, again, back to Marcus's point, we see ourselves as, you know, as a movement organization.
Yeah.
It's far more aligned with, you know, the Black Panthers than we do with, you know, some genteel nonprofit. So when we started talking to our young people in March and we said, what do you need? They said, we need technology support. And we provided 150 laptops and hotspots so that our young people, already difficult enough to work at home, can now at least access the learning that they were sent home to learn. Still today, there was an article today that still New York City public school students don't have computers, thousands of them. So we had to provide them. We asked our young people what they needed, and they said emergency financial support to pay critical, essential bills, from pharmacy bills to light bills to phone bills to, in many cases, rent bills, because their parents were the first people to lose jobs. And so we've gotten out the door over $100,000 to pay critical bills. And then the third area they talked about was food insecurity, right? Parents are losing jobs. If young people are losing critically important part-time jobs, these are not part-time jobs just to go to the movies or buy the most recent sneakers. Teenagers are helping with critical bills in their family. They said, we need food support. And so 1 week after New York City was a complete shutdown, I mean, when they were burying bodies in a mass grave in Queens, we reopened our doors, and every Wednesday since then have provided food. We've provided 350,000 meals since mid-March, not just to our young people, but as we started feeding them, the general community, Black and brown folk in Harlem, Black and Latinx, came and said, we need food too. And we didn't turn our back. We said, we have to figure this out. And in an entrepreneurial way, which often, to Marcus's point, is the antithesis of how things operate in the nonprofit sector, we said, what do we need to do? And we got a U-Haul truck, and we picked up food at a warehouse, and we bagged it together. And in the midst of the crisis, our staff dedicated to coming in and creating a situation where now we are feeding thousands of families a month, 350,000 meals a year, and that community needs it. And so we did that because the need was there, not because we got a grant, because quite honestly, we didn't get a grant, not because we did some kind of analysis of, you know, structural response to poverty. People were hungry, and so we fed them. Yeah,
it's important. Thanks. So a question that comes from one of our listeners, you know, is about, you know, most of this funding that comes in, you know, in government funding, right? You know, it's project based, you know, for you know, low income housing tax credits, for example, and the need is justice work, as we've been discussing. So, you know, how do you do that magic? You know, move the money from, you know, sort of the narrow technical government line to actually meet the needs of Black and brown communities.
So I think it's tricky. I mean, I think that's a tricky question it's a good question, but it's also on the heels of what Kari just said.
Yeah.
Around you know, I think the sector, whether it's philanthropy, government, et cetera, would say the work Kari just described is not movement work. Like, and right, like that, or that's what I hear, right?
Mm.
You know what I mean? And I think that's part of the issue. I think about, sort of the work of organizations who are doing the work, right? That there is a, if we kind of submit to the framings of philanthropy and how money flows, there is this service to justice continuum, right? I don't believe in the continuum, but like, if there is that continuum, I think part of the point is that organizations like Bro Sis are sort of, their work fits on more than just one place on that continuum, right? And I think that and there's this sort of subculture to where, well, if you're giving folk meals, if you're feeding people, you're not doing justice work, right? Or if you're organizing, sort of that you're not responding to the felt needs of institutions. And I think that is just a unfair and unrealistic binary that organizations are pushed to operate within. And so I think that the question around, the low-income tax credits, I think there's a way in which, like, how we integrate, I mean, how we operate with and operate in relationship with government, philanthropy, et cetera, in lifting up, what our work is, cannot be, I think it's really important from a narrative, cannot be done at the in opposition to another type of work on that continuum. That we have to sort of have our language and our work rooted in liberation, as opposed to well, let me differentiate my justice work from feeding people, right? And I think it's a dangerous thing that white supremacy and patriarchy and capitalism says that we need to do to be sustained as institutions.
Thanks. Tony, I think I'm going to ask you to jump in. I mean, you're familiar with the low-income housing tax credit.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that we've talked about over and over again. And I think, Kari, your analogy about the aircraft carrier, it all depends on what you prioritize spending the money on. If you keep investing it in the low-income housing tax credit, and I support that. I've a number of organizations that we support who utilize the program, who are very effective in utilizing it for affordable housing. But I will say the way the program is structured, affordability, the compliance period expires at some point in time. And then that is the opportunity to convert that to market rate housing. And so that's where the affordability challenge comes in. And in fact, when you do the analysis, we're actually losing more affordable housing from the program through expiration than it can create. So again, I know that folks who are advocating for it are pushing for more resources in that regard, but we're saying, why not couple that with an approach that results in the housing that's created being protected permanently as affordable, as opposed to allowing it to expire at some point in time. And yes, that's different. That takes some imagination, some new skills. It's going to take additional resources, but why not do that for the good of our own people, so to speak? The other aspect of this is we've been pushing and advocating for some type of large-scale federal funding to really promote the concept of community control of land and housing. And again, based in organizing, local organizing. And there are a number of successful examples. Our members across the country are utilizing that approach. We've got data that proves it's successful for the families that are being served, but they've not had the resources to scale that. And that's really one of the big focus areas of our work. I announced this year that over the next 10 years, our goal is to create 1 million new units with this approach of lasting affordability in order to intervene in the cycle and be a part of the solution. Kari, you talking about New York City's numbers, the numbers I saw pre-COVID said nationally 18 million families were paying more than 30% of their income on housing, which again, it's a problem for them to be able to sustain that. And so really wanting to figure out, well, if I can't help all 18 million of those folks, how can I at least address something that's significant in terms of having an impact? And certainly want the low-income housing tax credit providers and all the other programs who are working in that space to contribute to the solution as well. But again, it's going to take some different approach, some imagination, some vision, some courage to take some additional risk that's not motivated solely by some amount of return monetarily or profit.
Right.
If I can jump in on that
yeah, go for
a
it.
second. I mean, just be clear, the country already got its return. I mean, Tony's talking about working land.
Yeah.
This is what I mean by you can't talk about these issues and not talk about race in America. You're talking about 250 years of enslavement of Black people, where people could not only own property, but were property. 1865, the greatest wealth in this country was not gold, it was enslaved human beings. Mm-hmm. Then you move to a period of time where you're supposed to get 40 acres and a mule, and people don't get their acres. And not only don't get their acres, but whoever figured out a way to get land, there's a concerted effort over 100 years to take all that land back, whether by force, by hook, or by crook. Can't own land. Marcus and his family, in a beautiful way, taking back family land. It's his family farm in Alabama. It's an incredibly beautiful story. The fact is he had to do that because of that history. The fact is Tony has to do his work because of that history. I mentioned the GI Bill already. Can't build wealth, can't buy land for no other reason that you're Black. And so now we're in a state today with a housing crisis for everybody, low-income people, white, Black, Asian, Indigenous, we know that, but disproportionately affecting Black folk who have not been able to purchase, secure, own, or retain land for nearly 400 years. And so we're doing our work in spite of that and have to come up with innovative solutions to create home ownership that proves an ROI to the very economic system that took that land in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thanks. Let's see. I wanted to ask about, this is a question on business, and if I was business and politics. So it's like, how can we build community power and political power by building up and investing in Black-owned businesses? What would that look like? So obviously, speaking of COVID, we know that Black-owned businesses have been hit very hard by it. But you know, what's our vision for how that could look different?
I'll just say one of my peers around my CEO of color table, Maurice Jones at LISC, recently, again, big, bold vision, Black leader, saying Project 10X, they call it, really addressing the racial wealth gap and saying over the next 10-year period, they want to create a $1 billion fund to really focus on supporting Black businesses and Black communities in, again, repairing this deficit that's been created by previous policies and exclusion from the mainstream economy. So I think we need to look at more examples from, again, more leaders of color who are directly connected, who have direct personal experience of what it is like to try to combat all the obstacles that are put in their way. There are some things that have to be unwound. I will just say a tangential but directly connected issue here is the racial appraisal gap that has been recently talked about. If you're Black and you get your home or your property appraised, if you're a business, you've got holdings that you might have appraised, and the appraiser knows the race of the owner, there's a gap there. It's quite obvious that some difference is being made. It doesn't matter where the property is located and what the actual features of the property are. There's been documented evidence of this lower value being assigned to Black-owned property. So I think if you're a business owner, you have some of the same struggles. You're trying to figure out how to access capital. Kara, you mentioned it earlier, and figure out, okay, well, what do I need in terms of resources to run my business? But the same financial system that, again, has this built-in systemic bias really assigns you a lesser amount of funds, or denies you entirely for some reason that isn't comparable to a white person who goes in and applies for the same financing. So we've got some real systemic work to do around addressing the issues.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I'll say about the power building piece, it is the thing is that, I think about, over quarantine, done a whole bunch of work in my backyard and realized that I like doing it, but I also don't like to rake. So I bought one of the blower machines, and so and where it can both blow, but also can suck stuff in and put it in the bag. And I just think it is really important, as we're trying to build businesses and economic power and build political power. Yes, we need to build stuff, like, you know what I mean? But if we are just sort of blowing stuff out and not keeping the vacuum from continuing to take land, to take resources, to take all the things that are embedded in a white supremacist built set of systems, we can have cool ideas if we don't stop or interrupt the vacuum that is sort of sucking resources and sucking political and economic power, right? And so it just has to be both and, building things, create like sort of cool strategy, innovative strategies, but we also have to like sort of stop the flow of normalized policies and ways in which wealth continues to get taken out of our communities.
Great. So I think we're at the last question, unfortunately. There's certainly could continue this conversation a lot longer, but what are some new stories and narratives that we need to be lifting up to advance racial and economic justice? Thought I'd close out with that, and that each of you have like a minute to think about that or respond to that.
I love to hear from both Tony and Kari, because I think sort of as at institutions, at sort of, although they're not nonprofit executives, but at these institutions, not just hearing from them, but hearing like on this webinar, but like sort of how do we create the spaces and venues where that Tony, wrote the article. There are many things Kari has written, et cetera, so they can live and learn out loud in ways to where you see their stories and the stories of others of how we're figuring this stuff out.
So, I would just say that I think one, very important part of this conversation and spaces that Tony and Marcus and I, are in, is that the importance of Black men having a conversation where we're naming patriarchy, where we're naming sexism, where we're naming misogyny, where we are realizing that anti-sexist, anti-misogynistic work is men's work. So often that was framed as women's work, that for so long, women's voices across ethnic backgrounds and racial backgrounds have been silenced and suppressed compared to the males in their group. And we know, no one more than Black women. And so I think when we're looking for solutions, it's about, yes, elevating the voices of Black women, getting out of the way. I don't think it's always about creating space, but it's actually about getting out of the way. And I think the second is something we haven't talked much about today, is about young people. That, when you talk about change in this country, it's always been young people who have driven movements for social change, teenagers, early 20s, civil rights movement, Black power movement, women's movement, LGBTQ movement for freedom and equality, just young people. And I think young people is where the passion and the energy and often the new ideas are. I don't believe that's the only place. I think that can be dangerous too if you're only looking to youth voices. But youth voices must be central, must be at the table, must be involved in every conversation. And I think we're seeing that today in movements across the country. But I still think too many people fall back into that space of talking about young people and not hearing from young people and listening to young people.
I appreciate that. That was one of the questions I couldn't quite get to, so I'm glad you touched on it. Tony, you want to close this out?
Yeah, I also don't think, Steve, it's necessarily quote, new stories and narratives that we need to be promoting. We just need to change some of the venues that they're being heard in. I think there are certainly decision-making tables that we all can agree we've not had access to. And so opening up some of those boardrooms and some of those back rooms where decisions get made, and some of the clubs might be a better outcome for us, and really, again, build some connection to the fact that these are human problems. They are not exclusively race-based issues. They're human issues. All of us want a decent life, respect, common decency, and the right to exercise our privileges that are agreed upon across the society. So I do think not necessarily creating some new stories and narratives, but really focusing on what are the audiences that need to hear them.
It's a good point. I do think we're at the hour, so much as I'd love to continue, I want to thank Tony Pickett, Marcus Littles, Kari LeVar White, and all of you for your excellent questions. We got to as many as we could. Thanks for joining us. Contact information for all our panelists are below. And again, after this webinar, there is a 5-question evaluation. It doesn't take long to fill out. Please do so. We really appreciate it. So thanks so much for joining us, and look forward to more webinars on related topics in 2021.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Invite us back, Steve.
All right, well do.